Affairs Forum. I'm Sue Thomas, President of City Club, and I welcome you all. Those of you here at the Governor Hotel, those of you listening on OPB or KBPS radio, or watching on Portland Community Media's CityNet 30. Thank you for joining City Club at our first Friday Forum of the New Year on this Friday, January 8th, 2010. Today we will hear a debate about ballot measures 66 and 67, Oregon's tax hike referenda. But first, some announcements. As always, in consideration of those sitting close to you and those in our radio and television audiences, I ask that everyone that is in the room that has not already silenced your cell phone to please do so now. As always, we offer our appreciation to our Friday Forum corporate sponsors whose generous financial support make these time-honored City Club luncheons possible. Please join me in a sincere thank you to our three winter quarter sponsors, the law firm of Stoll Reeves, financial services company The Standard, and West Coast Bank. We appreciate your support. If your company or firm would like to be a Friday Forum sponsor, please contact the City Club staff at the back of the room or call the City Club office. At next Friday's forum, Oregon State economist Tom Patowski and University of Oregon economics professor Timothy Dewey will discuss Oregon's economy, and they may also speculate on what will happen if ballot measures 66 or 67 pass or don't pass. So please be sure to tune in next week. In a moment, I will introduce our moderator, who will explain the rules of procedure for our debate and introduce the debaters. But first, I want to remind us all that part of City Club's mission is to inform our members and our community regarding public issues. I mention this because we cannot achieve City Club's mission if we're not open to information and views that are different from our own personal opinions. As such, I ask that everyone in the room to remain courteous and respectful and open to the information conveyed even when you disagree with it. By doing so, you help further the kind of civic and civil discourse that City Club stands for. And you will honor our guest speakers, our own process, and the interests of our community. And now to introduce our moderator. Sharon Van Sickle-Robbins co-founded KVO Advertising and Public Relations in 1983 and was responsible for directing the firm's operations and providing strategic oversight for its public relations department. She now operates a cut flower business on Sauvie Island. Sharon has been a City Club member since 1996. In 2008, she chaired the City Club study on enhancing Portland's business environment, which looked at the various factors that contribute to a healthy business climate. She's currently City Club's president-elect. Sharon?
Thank you for the opportunity to be here today, and welcome. It is my privilege to moderate this debate on ballot measures 66 and 67 between Mr. Steve Novick, policy analyst for Vote Yes for Oregon, who supports the measures, and Mr. Pat McCormick, partner at Conkling, Fiskum, and McCormick, who opposes the measures. First, a brief description of the ballot measures before us today. In 2009, the Oregon Legislature passed two bills as part of a larger effort to address the state's fiscal crisis and balance the state's budget. One bill raised taxes on high-income earners. The other increased the state's corporate minimum tax and levied new taxes on corporate revenue. Critics of this tax increase legislation successfully collected enough signatures to bring voter consent of these taxes to the ballot, as allowed by Oregon's initiative and referendum system. The two ballot measures being debated today, measures 66 and 67, will determine the fate of these tax increases. A yes vote on measure 66 raises taxes on incomes above $250,000 for households and $125,000 for individual filers, providing an estimated $472 million in funds currently budgeted for education, healthcare, public safety, and other services. A no vote rejects these personal income tax increases. A yes vote on Measure 67 raises the $10 corporate minimum tax, the business minimum tax, and the corporate profits tax, and provides an estimated $255 million currently budgeted for public services. A no vote would retain the current corporate and business tax structure. And now a brief description of the format of our debate today. This debate will have several sections. First, each speaker will give a 3-minute opening statement. Following the opening statements, speakers will respond to questions developed in advance of this meeting by City Club's Friday Forum Committee and members of City Club staff. These are the only questions that will be asked today. There will be no questions from the floor. We will rely on the judgment of our distinguished panel of City Club members seated at the table below to decide whether or not the questions have indeed been answered by the speakers. If two or more of these members raise their cards indicating that they feel a question has not been answered, I will repeat the question and ask the speaker to reply once more, but for less time. On our panel, we have Brianne Arnold, Marge Kafuri, and Ted Kay. Our timekeepers today are Tony Icarino and Elaine McCall. Following City Club's questions, each speaker will have the opportunity to ask 3 questions of the other speaker. After the rotation of questions, each speaker will make a 3-minute closing statement. Please be respectful of the speakers, and please hold all applause until the end of the program. And now the speakers. An Oregon native, Steve Novick graduated from the University of Oregon and received his law degree from Harvard Law School. He spent 9 years as an environmental law enforcement lawyer at the U.S. Justice Department in Washington, D.C., before returning to Oregon in 1996. He has since served as policy director in Governor Kulongoski's 2002 campaign, as communications director for Citizens for Oregon's Future, a nonprofit dedicated to providing reliable information on tax and budget issues, as legislative liaison for Superintendent of Public Instruction Susan Castillo, and he has worked on numerous campaigns to defeat ballot measures sponsored by Bill Sizemore. Mr. Novick won 42% of the vote as a candidate in the 2008 Democratic primary for U.S. Senate, carrying Multnomah, Benton, and Clatsop counties. He is now a policy analyst for Vote Yes for Oregon, the group supporting the passage of Measures 66 and 67. As a partner at Conkling, Fiskum, and McCormick, Pat McCormick has more than 35 years of public policy and communications experience. His public policy role began in 1973 as Chief of Staff to Oregon House Majority Leader Les Aucoin. He later became Aucoin's Oregon Staff Director after Aucoin's election to Congress. Mr. McCormick returned to the state capitol in 1979 as Chief of Staff to House Speaker Hardy Myers. He then founded his own public affairs firm and directed the state's high-tech trade association. He joined Conkling, Fiskum, and McCormick in 1991 and has since managed communications on more than 20 Oregon ballot measure campaigns. In 1999, he received the William Marsh Lifetime Achievement Award from the Public Relations Society of America. He is currently the communications coordinator for Oregonians Against Job-Killing Taxes, the main group opposing Measures 66 and 67. Will the speakers please take their podiums? Mr. Novick, please begin with your opening statement.
This campaign comes down to 4 questions. The first is, do we care about education, healthcare, and public safety? Those services make up 90% of the general fund budget. Those are the services these measures are designed to protect. We're talking about whether a 4th grader gets to keep her favorite teacher, whether a frail senior citizen gets to keep the person who comes in to help him get dressed and make sure he doesn't fall down in the bathtub. Those are the stakes. The second question is, do we think a couple making $260,000 a year can pay another $200 to protect those services? That's what Measure 66 is about. 2% of income above $250,000. And no, it's not an attack on small business owners, 93% of whom don't make enough money to be affected. The third question is, should corporations pay a little more than $10 a year in income taxes? And I mean a little more. Over 90% of Oregon businesses will either see no change in their taxes or will see a $150 a year tax increase. Some big corporations will either see a 1.3% increase in the profits tax rate or they will pay an alternative minimum tax equal to 0.1% of their Oregon revenues. By contrast, a typical Oregon family pays 5% of its gross income in Oregon income taxes. The fourth question is, what's best for the economy? In the long term, economists tell us it's more important to invest in education than to worry about whether we're 48th or 46th in the country in corporate taxes, which is what we're talking about. In the short term, economists tell us that in a recession, you want to keep money moving through the economy. The money we spend on teachers and home health care workers that they will spend in their local communities all goes into the Oregon economy. Rich people, bless their hearts, and some of my best friends are rich people, tend to spend some of their money on European vacations or investments in the New York Stock Exchange. Meanwhile, most of the money raised by the corporate profits tax is paid by out-of-state corporations headquartered out of state. For instance, if I look across through my bathroom and kitchen, I find a lot of Procter & Gamble stuff. They'll be paying an increased profits tax. The biggest checks under the corporate minimum tax will also be paid by out-of-state corporations. There's a bunch of corporations that make $100 million in Oregon that will be paying a little more, and they're headquartered out of state. 4 questions, 4 answers, all of which I'm sure you'll agree, being that you're members of the City Club and listeners in OPB, that I'm sure that you'll agree point to a yes vote on Measure 66 and 67.
Mr. McCormick, your opening statement.
Thank you, Sharon, and members of the City Club and guests. It's a pleasure to be here today to be able to talk about these issues and to spend more time with my friend Steve, who we've seen more of one another lately than I've seen with my wife. Our disagreement with backers of Measure 66 and 67 isn't about maintaining funding for schools and other essential public services. That was never the issue during the last legislative session, and it isn't the issue in this debate. The business community came forward early in the last legislative session with proposals to protect funding for education and other public services. It included increasing the corporate minimum tax. It also included temporary taxes to help us bridge the current economic crisis. Our beef in this terrible fight is enacting these tax measures and the impediment that they're going to create, if they pass, for a struggling private sector that has lost 131,000 private sector jobs in this state since the recession started and has suffered trying to regrow those jobs. If those jobs were restored, we wouldn't have a state finance problem to deal with. Legislative leaders were intent on making these taxes permanent, despite the business community's willingness to look at temporary taxation. These measures go in the wrong direction. The committee that was created by the legislature on comprehensive revenue restructuring recommended appropriate measures to improve the stability of Oregon's tax system. These take us in the wrong direction. Measure 66 significantly increases taxes that are being paid through the personal income tax structure in exact opposite to the recommendations that were made by the Revenue Restructuring Task Force. It also increases the amount of taxation from capital gains, because 41% of the income in those upper brackets is from capital gains. Further increasing, as the Legislative Revenue Office noted, we'll have bigger kickers and more frequent kickers as a result of that change. The business tax increases in Measure 67 represent a 40% increase in state business taxes in the middle of the worst recession since World War II. These increased taxes are going to impede the ability of Oregon businesses to restore the jobs that have been lost in this recession. Without recognition of the impacts on the economy, these tax proposals, which were made permanent, will make it much more difficult for us to come to the long-term solutions we need to get the kind of finance structure that will protect public services, schools, and the other things that are important to Oregonians. The business community of this state has been a strong partner in seeking that kind of an outcome, and it opposes these taxes because we believe they take us in the wrong direction.
We will now move to the portion of the program where I will ask the questions prepared in advance by the Friday Forum Committee and City Club staff. The speaker to whom the question is directed will have 60 seconds to respond to the question. Following each answer, the opposing speaker will have the option of a 45-second rebuttal. Following the individual questions, I will direct an identical question to both speakers. Each speaker will have 60 seconds to respond to those questions. The speakers have not seen these questions in advance. The first question is for Mr. Novick. President Barack Obama and Oregon Republican Party Chairman Bob Tiernan share one thing in common. They agree that the depths of the Great Recession would seem the worst time to be raising taxes. How do you justify raising taxes to someone who is currently unemployed, especially when it's claimed that such tax increases will force some businesses to lay off more workers?
Someone currently unemployed is actually going to get a tax break. Measure 66 exempts from income taxes the first $2,400 of unemployment benefits that person received in 2009. We are raising revenue to protect services for the young, for vulnerable Oregonians, to make sure that people who've lost their health insurance still have health insurance, to make sure that seniors still have care. As for President Obama is the President of the United States, the head of the federal government, which has the luxury of running deficits. The state government has a choice of either cutting important services or trying somehow to raise revenue. President Obama's own budget director, Peter Orszag, a distinguished economist, has written on this topic and has said it's a no-brainer. If states have a choice between cutting services where the money's all spent within the state or raising taxes from rich people who wouldn't spend all their money within the state, Orszag said it's a no-brainer. You raise taxes on people who make a lot of money.
Mr. McCormick, you have 45 seconds to respond if you wish.
Let me first say that what Peter Orszag said in that memorandum was not as it was described by Steve. The recommendations that came out of that were between the question, between the choice states have to make of cutting taxes, cutting spending or raising taxes in a recession, that the best of the alternatives is to increase federal subsidies and support to provide stimulus funds to the states, and that's what the Obama administration did. President Obama and Bob Tiernan do share an important economic principle that when you are struggling, the best way to help an economy recover is to create the jobs that are necessary, and taxation works against that.
Mr. McCormick, some business leaders have argued that no services have to suffer if these measures are defeated, but approximately 90% of the state budget pays for education, human services, and public safety. If you succeed in defeating these measures, what specific parts of the education, human services, and public safety budget would you cut in order to help address the estimated $770 million budget shortfall?
It's a $727 million is what's estimated to be raised by these taxes. We have remaining in reserves nearly $400 million that could be spent to help address those questions. But the business community is not about cutting. The business community has been supportive of education. The proposal that we came forward with in the last legislative session would have raised more money than the legislative package to provide cover for state programs during the current economic crisis. The opportunities that were left unaddressed by the legislature in its regular session last year will be available to it the week following the voters' decision on this set of measures when it meets in special session to deal with budget issues. We believe it still has plenty of choices, as the Oregonian did, as the Portland Tribune did this week in their editorials. There are plenty of choices left to ensure that we protect those public services and don't make cuts in this upcoming special session.
Mr. Novick, rebuttal? Excuse me.
Yes, panel?
You have 45 seconds to address that again.
The business community supported funding for education at the level that is in the state budget currently and supports that if we come back in special session after these measures are defeated. The business community has brought forward an array of proposals to help rebalance the budget that include temporary tax increases. We proposed a change to the corporate minimum tax that would have raised it from $10 to $300. We see a number of opportunities for the legislature to come back and address the differential between available reserves and full funding of the current budget to make sure we don't have to have those kind of cuts in this session.
Now, 45-second rebuttal.
I don't know where to start. First of all, you should never raise taxes during a recession, but it would have been okay to raise taxes as long as it was only during the recession. And second, Mr. McCormick says that yes, he was worried about cuts, but I read their website and it says the legislature didn't need to raise any taxes, they had plenty of money. Third, yes, your clients did suggest that we raise taxes across the board on all Oregonians, middle income tax increases, just like we did in 2003 and 2004, and the usual right-wingers referred the measure to the ballot, and they lost, while your clients, frankly, Pat, sat on their hands. As to reserves, the legislature already spent down the reserves so much that the Oregonian criticized them for it, and they promised that if the reserves are over a certain amount next June, they'll give $200 million to schools, and the schools are counting on that.
Thank you. Mr. Novick, why should the wealthiest Oregonians pay a higher percentage of their personal income under Measure 66 for the very services they are less likely to use, such as public K-12 education, public universities, and human services? Is that fair?
The rich Oregonians who I know, and people like Warren Buffett and people like E.A. Filene back in the Depression, have said they benefited from these services when they were growing up. They benefit from the existence of a civilized society as people who've done well in that society. They benefit from the existence of an education system, for the existence of a public safety system, which ensures that people don't get out and steal all their stuff. There's a lot of very thoughtful rich people who are voting for these measures. But another part of the answer is, I believe in America, the real America of 1955, when Eisenhower was president, when Chevrolet was king, when Mantle and Mays and Snyder were in the outfield, and when rich people were paying their fair share of taxes, when the top rate in Oregon was 11%, when the rate at the federal level, I wouldn't tell you what that was. That's the America that I believe in, and Pat, I want my America back.
Mr. McCormick, a 45-second response, if you wish.
One of the things that I think it's important to note is that the base on which we charge those tax rates changes substantially over time. And the reason our rates are lower now is that the base has expanded, the amount that is collected in taxes has continued to increase. But let me say about the 2.27% of Oregonians that are currently the target for Measure 66. That group of people is already paying 32.4% of the income taxes collected in this state. They're paying for 1 in 3 teachers, 1 in 3 state police officers, 1 in 3 prison guards. Our system has always been viewed as an extremely fair, very progressive tax system. The top end pays at a steep rate. That's what I think represents fairness.
Mr. McCormick, some have argued that the wealthy don't shy away from high personal income taxes, but others claim that wealthy families will leave the state should Measure 66 pass. What evidence can you provide that a higher marginal income tax will send wealthy Oregonians packing?
Well, the easiest thing to look at in this county is what happened during the years when Multnomah County had an increase, a surtax of 1.25%, as I recall. During that period of time, the high-income filers, and you can see this in the Oregon Department of Revenue records, shrunk substantially in Multnomah County and went back up again after those temporary increases in income taxes went away. The people who are in these tax brackets are the most sophisticated and the most mobile of taxpayers when it comes to how to use their capabilities to minimize their tax impact. That's why Clark County benefits by being right across the river from Portland, and why the Columbian, after these taxes were passed, thanked the Oregon Legislature for the best economic development tool they had. Their own legislature hadn't done as well for them.
Mr. Novick, a 45-second rebuttal.
On average, in a given year, the people who move to Clark County from Multnomah are poorer than the ones who stay. Take a look at a study called Trends in New Jersey Migration. There's only one such study, just Google it. It shows that it's a Princeton study that shows that when New Jersey raised taxes on rich people in 2004, a few rich people got grumpy and left. About as many as liberals who actually moved to Canada after George Bush was reelected. But it was so few that they called it a small side effect. Google the 100 richest zip codes in America. Look through them. 30 of them are in New York City or in California, which have extremely high, relatively high tax rates on rich people. California and New York City only have 15% of the population of the country. Apparently, rich people like being taxed.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Novick, if the legislature had made these personal and corporate income tax increases modest and temporary, as numerous business leaders suggested, the increases would likely have earned the support of organizations like the Oregon Business Association and would probably not have faced a referendum challenge. Why didn't the legislature pass a more modest and temporary package of tax increases?
I am afraid I have to dispute part of your question. In 2003 and 2004, the legislature played it Mr. McCormick's way. They passed temporary, across-the-board tax increases on all Oregonians, just as Mr. McCormick's client suggested in this legislative session. Then the usual right-wingers referred those measures to the ballot. Well, they referred one of them, one the legislature sent directly. And Mr. McCormick's clients, largely with minimal exceptions, sat on their hands while the right wing defeated those measures. And as a result, we cut 50,000 people off the Oregon Health Plan. Thousands of seniors and people with disabilities were told they were no longer disabled enough to get help. And schools closed early all across Oregon. We wound up in Doonesbury. That's what would have happened if we played it Mr. McCormick's way again.
Mr. McCormick, you have 45 seconds to respond.
The opportunity that was before this past legislature to look at reasonable alternatives for funding necessary services, including schools, included temporary taxation. It also included what we had proposed in terms of permanent changes on the corporate minimum. There are strategies that could and should have been developed, but the major strategy that the legislature ignored from the recommendations of the Revenue Restructuring Task Force that the business community has strongly supported was kicker reform. Voters in Oregon, we provided them information that showed voters in Oregon are prepared to support kicker reform so that instead of sending money back to taxpayers, it's put instead into a savings account that we can use on a rainy day. That would have helped us through this particular recession.
Thank you. Mr. McCormick, according to the Council on State Taxation, a nonprofit trade association consisting of over 600 corporations, Oregon currently has the third lowest state and local business tax burden in the United States. Even if Measure 67 passes, Oregon will still have the lowest business tax burden on the West Coast and the fifth lowest in the United States. So how can you argue that Oregon businesses will suddenly face a competitive disadvantage if the measure passes?
It is really interesting to me that the proponents of this tax use the cost study, as you point out, 600 of the largest corporations in the country. They do this study annually to make one single point as clearly as they can, which is that in every state and jurisdiction in this country, businesses pay more in taxes than they get back in services from the public sector. And I don't think that's really what the proponents believe. The Ernst & Young folks, and we've talked with the economists who actually did the study, doesn't include all, in the attempt to aggregate all of the costs that business face, they've missed some and they've inappropriately reported some, especially as it relates to the amount of business taxation that comes in through the personal income tax structure in Oregon. We actually, on corporate tax rates, I've always been in the middle of the pack. Legislative Revenue Office data shows that to be true. We are a lower state than others because we don't have a sales tax. How many in the room would like us to have a sales tax in order to increase businesses? Well, good. You don't represent most Oregonians, but I'm glad to see it.
A rebuttal, if you like.
Pat thinks I'm even lazier than I am. He said this before, and I called Ernst & Young, and they stand by their statement. Oregon is 48th in the country in terms of state and local taxes on businesses. As Mr. McCormick says, part of that is because we don't have a sales tax. In a typical state, businesses pay sales taxes on everything they buy. It's the second biggest tax that they pay. In Oregon, on the personal side, we make up for the absence of a sales tax by having unusually high income tax rates on middle-income people. On the corporate side, we don't make up for the absence of a sales tax at all, which is why we are 48th. In other states without a sales tax, like Delaware and New Hampshire, they adopt separate taxes on business, just like Measure 67 would impose.
Thank you. Mr. Novick, Measure 67 doesn't simply increase taxes on many businesses. One of its more controversial provisions is that it taxes gross receipts rather than simply taxing profits. This could lead to taxing unprofitable or low-margin businesses, making their survival more tenuous. Why tax gross receipts and not profits?
Well, we have a gross receipts tax in the state. It's called the personal income tax, which forces a typical family of four to pay 5% of its gross revenue in income taxes. Even a corporation that's really not making a profit still benefits from the existence of an education system and a public safety system. But, you know, some of these big national corporations that we're writing the big checks, who knows if they really have profits? I mean, they're paying their CEOs millions. Who knows what they've got stashed in overseas tax havens? But another thing is, what we're talking about as an alternative minimum tax is 0.1% of their gross revenues. I talked to a business representative yesterday who was under the impression that it's a 7.5%. It was actually somebody from Fred Meyer, thought it was a 7.5% gross receipts tax. I explained to her that it was 0.1%, and she said, oh. Let me tell you what 0.1% is. I have here 17.5 bags of M&Ms. I throw Pat one M&M, that's 0.1%.
I'd like to ask the audience to keep their amusement more toned down. Mr. McCormick, businesses, would you have a rebuttal?
I do. Thank you, Sharon. And I didn't catch the M&M either, so that's the kind of day it's been. Oregon is one of 44 states that follows the federal model for corporate taxation. We use their federal system because it makes it easier for us to manage our own system. Of the 44 states, 19 have minimum taxes. Fewer than half have any minimum tax at all. 17 of the 19 are flat rate minimum taxes like Oregon's has been. 2 of them, New York State and Minnesota, have graduated taxes somewhat like Measure 67 that go from Minnesota's case 0, New York's $25 on the bottom end, to a maximum of $5,000. 67 would go $150,000 to $100,000. It's a complete outlier. It's just a new tax on C corporations in Oregon.
Mr. McCormick, businesses locate in a state for a variety of reasons beyond the tax rate, including good schools and public services. Aren't a strong school system and other basic services, which these 2 measures are designed to support, good for business?
Absolutely they are, and that's why business community is strongly supportive of public services, and especially schools and education. We've been upset with the legislature's pattern of disinvestment in education over the last several biennia, not just in K-12 schools, but maybe more concerned to businesses what's happened to higher education and community colleges. Our workforce comes from those places, so investments in those parts of public service are especially important to business. We believe that the long-term health of Oregon's finance system is the most important target to focus on. We were prepared to provide short-term funding to help bridge this current crisis so we could have the discussion necessary to find long-term solutions that give us a more stable, dependable system for funding the public services businesses and all Oregonians rely on.
Mr. Novick, 45 seconds.
If all the businesses cared about was taxes, Oregon, with the 3rd lowest taxes on business in the country, would be like Dr. Seuss's Sala Salou, where they never have troubles, at least very few. And North Carolina, which is the only state significantly lower than us in business taxes, would be Boulaboo Ball, where they never have troubles, no troubles at all. Instead, both Oregon and North Carolina right now have higher than average unemployment rates. And again, as far as Mr. McCormick's and his clients' commitment to funding education, to making changes to the kicker, when the kicker was on the ballot in 2000, his clients didn't lift a finger to keep it out of the Constitution. When there was a temporary tax measure in 2004, they barely lifted a finger to pass it.
The next set of questions will be for both speakers. Each speaker will have 60 seconds to respond to the very same question. And we'll begin with Mr. McCormick. A word about Oregon's referendum process itself. Oregon is one of 24 states that allow citizens the opportunity to place referenda on the ballot to repeal acts of the legislature. but it's only among a handful of states that allow referenda on legislative revenue measures. Given that voters are not actually responsible for balancing the state's budget, should they really have the unique constitutional right to repeal revenue legislation?
Well, let me first say that I don't independently get to decide that. All Oregonians have decided on the system we have and have adopted in our Constitution more than 100 years ago the initiative and referendum process. We were the first state to have it. In the 100 years since, there have been 20 tax referenda, and only 2 have passed. In 1929, the legislature passed an income tax to replace the state sales tax. It was referred to the ballot, and in 1930 it passed with about 52% of the vote. And in 1972, a cigarette tax passed with about 50.9%. But the average has been, for Oregonians, that they have said no by a margin of 2 to 1 on all the state tax referenda that they have seen. Is it great tax policy? There are lots of times I would prefer we didn't have the level of direct democracy that we do. But it isn't up to us to decide. The Oregon voters get to decide that.
Mr. Novick, you have 60 seconds.
I suggest that everybody in this audience go to Conkling Fiskum McCormick's website and read the Insider online essay from January 12, 2004, called Our Love Affair Hating Government. And it bewailed the fact that due to the referendum system, the tax measures the legislature passed then were sent to the ballot with crushing results. And it posed the question, who is really responsible for early school closures or the shredding of our model social safety net? This time, if these measures are defeated by the ads that Mr. McCormick is running, like the one the Oregonian exposed as deceptive this morning, saying that the legislature has plenty of money, if these measures are defeated, I know at least one person who will be responsible for early school closures and the shredding of our model social service safety net, and his name is Pat McCormick.
Please hold your responses. Our next question will begin with Mr. Novick. Despite their differences, Republican and Democratic legislators, as well as business and union leaders, all agree that Oregon needs long-term reforms to address our chronic revenue shortfalls. Setting aside for now your immediate arguments in favor or against Measures 66 and 67, what specific long-term revenue solutions, such as sales tax or kicker reform, would you endorse?
Well, the Revenue Restructuring Task Force that Pat's talking about did say that we should consider more stable sources of revenue than we have now. The corporate minimum tax, which includes this stair-step gross receipts feature, is, as the Revenue Restructuring Task Force says, a more stable source of revenue than our existing sources. But Mr. McCormick's team opposes that. It also said we needed a bigger rainy day fund. The permanent tax increase on corporate profits, the money from that is going to be dedicated to a rainy day fund. But Mr. McCormick's team opposes that. The legislators have said that they're interested in reforming the kicker to help create a bigger rainy day fund. They didn't focus on that this session, partly because when your house is on fire, you don't go out and shop for a better sprinkler system. You grab a hose and put the fire out. If these measures fail, I think the legislatures will be terrified of throwing anything at the voters with the word tax in it for years. If they pass, we've got a shot at more comprehensive measures.
Mr. McCormick. Oh, I'm sorry, you have 45 seconds to try again.
What reforms do you endorse? Oh, what reforms do I endorse? Well, actually, I'm sorry, I thought that was implicit in my answer. I endorse taking action to build a stronger rainy day fund. And it's not my place in the campaign to endorse a particular thing, but the legislators have said that they would take a look at altering the kicker to put some of the unexpected money into a rainy day fund. I certainly endorse Measure 67, which says that the permanent increase in the corporate profits tax, the money for that should be put into a rainy day fund. And it establishes this alternative corporate minimum tax, which is a more stable source of revenue, as the Revenue Office has said, than many of our existing sources.
Mr. McCormick, you have 60 seconds for the same question.
Thank you. From a personal standpoint, and not speaking necessarily on behalf of the coalition that I represent, the reform of the kicker, which is something the coalition does support, is a high priority for me. In looking at other mechanisms that can improve the stability of Oregon's tax system, I've been around this process now for, as your introduction said, more than 30 years. The first measure I was out working was McCall's tax plan in 1973, which went out during the legislative session. There have been lots of looks at how to fix Oregon's tax structure to make it more stable. Unfortunately, some of the referenda that we've had that came along, like Measure 5 and so forth, have made our task of finding a better system for public finance that much more difficult. Sales tax we've looked at. I've supported some and opposed some through my career. At some point, some mechanism has to be found, but we need a dialogue of legislative and state leaders outside the legislature to find the answer to this question.
Thank you. Now we're going to move to the portion of the program where each speaker will ask 3 questions of the other. Questions must be asked in 30 seconds. The opposing speaker will have 1 minute to respond, after which the questioner will have the option of a 30-second rebuttal. We will alternate between the speakers and begin with Mr. Novick.
Pat, as the Oregonian reported this morning, you are currently running an ad which attacks the legislature for allegedly increasing spending by billions of dollars. As the Oregonian pointed out, most of that money is money the federal government gave us for unemployment benefits and food stamps and Medicaid for people who have lost their jobs and health insurance. Do you believe that the legislature should have refused that money and let people who've lost their jobs and health insurance suffer?
I certainly don't believe that we wanted to make anyone suffer more than they already are in the midst of this terrible recession. The money that we were able to get thanks to Peter Orzog's proposals and the stimulus money that came from the federal government has helped underpin the safety net in this state, and it's benefited especially schools in this state in a very successful way. But the legislature had the ability to husband the resources that were coming from the federal government so it could help tide us over for a longer period of time instead of spending it down. The challenge for us is how do we sustain the level of spending we're at today? And because so much of that stimulus money is already gone when we come back, if the economy had gotten worse, or it may still, or in the 2013 budget that's coming up, the increased costs we know we're going to be facing for PERS, all those things have to be taken into account. And at this point, the management of resources is our biggest concern.
Mr. Novick, you have 30 seconds to respond.
As Mr. McCormick knows, much of the money that the state gets from the federal government is dependent on state matching funds. If you don't put up the state funds, you don't put up the federal funds. Right now, the Department of Human Services has a list of potential cuts if these measures fail. And even though they tried their best to avoid cutting anything with federal match, they say that we would lose $169 million in matching federal funds if they simply took their proportionate share of budget cuts.
Mr. McCormick, your first question of Mr. Novick.
In its editorial this week, the Portland Tribune pointed to what it called deceptive campaigning. How do you respond to this point that they made? Measure 66 proponents repeatedly make the claim that their target, Oregonians who make $125,000 or more, would see only a 1.8% increase in taxes. Those same supporters also know that the statement is untrue. These high-income individuals would actually see a 20% or more increase in their top level of taxation.
Well, I think that when you say that the tax rate is going to go up by 1.8%, people know that the rate is going to go up by 1.8%. There's an anti-tax group called the Tax Foundation, which if you look on their website now, it says that California raised their sales tax by 1%, from 6% to 7%. If they followed Mr. McCormick's logic, they would have had to say that California raised its sales tax by 16%. The Tax Foundation is not a pro-tax group. It's a group that uses normal colloquial English.
Mr. McCormick, rebuttal.
In our editorial board visit with Willamette Week, they significantly reminded you of what most math teachers in this state would say, that it's a 20% increase.
And then Mark Zussman used the same terminology later on in the discussion.
Mr. Novick, your next question of Mr. McCormick.
Pat, you oppose raising Oregon from 48th in the country to 46th in business taxes by asking big corporations to spend 1/10 of 1% of their gross income on schools. but you supported a major increase in the gas tax, which will cost the typical Oregon family almost 0.2% of its gross income. Why do you believe that roads are more important than schools and corporations deserve better treatment than families?
The increase in transportation taxes and fees that will help underpin a program that I think local governments and business have been supporting for a long time, we finally managed through this legislative session to get such a package passed. It employs people in this state and improves the infrastructure that's important for us to move forward. The business community hasn't opposed putting that same kind of an investment into public education, and in fact consistently has supported it and derided the legislative disinvestment that's been going on in education. To us, it isn't a choice of one or the other. We can have both in this state. We need a reasonable finance system, though, in order to be able to pay for the public services that we want. The current tax system is flawed, and these measures would make it much worse.
Mr. Novick?
There are jobs in education and healthcare and public safety, too. Transportation jobs aren't the only jobs in the public sector. If these measures are defeated and K-12 takes its proportionate share of the cut, and remember the only alternatives are healthcare and public safety, that's the equivalent of 1,500 teaching jobs and 1,000 bus driver, cafeteria worker, and custodial jobs.
Mr. McCormick, your next question of Mr. Novick.
Your campaign has characterized opponents of these measures as Wall Street bankers, credit card companies, and the filthy rich. Our coalition includes Main Street bankers, farmers, small businesses, loggers, real estate people, gas station owners, and apparently from the finance side, far too few of the filthy rich, because it's public employee unions who are spending millions to pass these taxes. Isn't your campaign about class warfare, as Willamette Week and the Oregonian have suggested?
Again, some of my best friends are rich people. Most of them are quite clean. I would never call them filthy. We have not said that the opponents of the measures are all Wall Street banks and credit card companies, although it's worth noting that the Oregon Bankers Association, which includes major national banks, is one of the biggest contributors to the campaign. We have said that Wall Street banks and credit card companies will pay some of the taxes. For example, I hope that my credit card company, Capital One, which last year said that it didn't have any profits but certainly took some money out of me, I hope that they pay some of our new alternative minimum tax. So no, this is not about class warfare. Again, we've seen many business leaders and people with money step up to support our campaign. People like my friend Arthur Graham, my friend Nick Blosser. These people are supporting our campaign because they know that we need this investment in public services.
Mr. McCormick?
What we have seen in this campaign is the kind of rhetoric that makes us all a little unhappy with the political process. Calling names, deciding that one side is good and the other side is bad, doesn't get us to the answers that we need in this state. We have tough public policy issues, the toughest of which is finding a public finance system that will work for the benefit of all of us, the businesses and the communities that require public services in order to be healthy.
Mr. Novick, your next question of Mr. McCormick.
Pat, 6 years ago, the legislature played it your way. They passed a temporary tax increase across the board on all Oregonians. The usual right-wingers gathered the signatures to force it to the ballot, and your clients, although some of them nominally supported the measure, did very little as the measures went down to defeat and we slashed education, health care, and public safety. What reason do you have to think that things would have been any different if the legislature had tried it your way again?
I think that the difference would well have been the concurrence about the need. What has not been present in this is a discussion about how do we get to the same page with all the players who have a stake in the outcome of these decisions. In this past legislative session, the business community came forward with proposals early in the session seeking to have the kind of dialogue typically that takes place in the legislative process where we're part of a discussion contributing what we need to contribute, giving at the table when asked, and we never got the chance in this legislative session to be part of that discussion. The agenda was set by others, pushed through, and all the efforts the business community made to be part of trying to address the real long-term problems as well as covering the current economic crisis were rebuked by the legislative leadership. It was disappointing to our business community that the legitimate role in the discussion about these issues never allowed the business community's voice to be heard.
Mr. Novick.
The right-wingers have made it clear that they would have referred any tax increase to the ballot. The ads Mr. McCormick is running right now saying the legislature has plenty of money would undermine any tax measure. The legislature listened to Mr. McCormick and his folks in 2004. The measures went to the ballot, and Mr. McCormick's clients did very little to pass them. Mr. McCormick's clients don't put their money where their mouth is. They only ever put their money where their money is.
Mr. McCormick, your next question of Mr. Novick.
In 2007, the state's major business organizations agreed to give up the corporate kicker, putting more than $300 million into the state to create the state's rainy day fund, the first one. Much of that corporate kicker-funded rainy day fund has been expended to help balance the current budget. Business groups have long advocated for kicker reform, but public employee unions have done nothing to advocate for the same kind of action on the personal kicker. Why weren't the unions pushing for kicker reform and better funding of reserves accounts in 2007 or in this past session?
Go and look at the voters' pamphlet statements for when the kicker was put in the Constitution in the year 2000. You will see a statement against putting it in the Constitution from the Oregon AFL-CIO. You will see a statement from the League of Women Voters. You will see one from John Kitzhaber. If you look at the ballot title comments, you will see one from me. You will not see a single, even a voters' pamphlet statement from Mr. McCormick or the clients that he represents. The public employee unions would be, I'm sure, excited as hell to talk about the kicker. But what you are doing now is claiming to be all gung-ho in favor of something that you've never expressed that much interest in before. I mean, look at what is on your website. Did the legislature really need to raise taxes to balance the budget? Not really. Despite the current economy, legislators still increased overall spending. The state already had $1 billion in extra cash reserves to spend without enacting blah, blah, blah. You are right now telling the voters there was tons of reserves even in this tough time. How can you possibly turn around and then say you need to turn the kicker into a rainy day fund?
Mr. McCormick.
The business community has long supported kicker reform. It demonstrated its willingness to give up its own kicker, $300 million we gave at the office, to support the idea of creating the rainy day fund. It was hard, and with a legislature controlled largely by folks who have helped in their election by public employee unions, when we did not get consistent support for our efforts to try to do that. When the Revenue Restructuring Task Force made that recommendation, it was ignored by this past session.
We will now move to the final portion of the program, 3-minute closing statements from each speaker. We will begin with Mr. Novick.
First of all, I just have to say, Mr. McCormick doesn't represent all of Oregon business. The Oregon Business Association is neutral on this measure. The Oregon Small Business Council is with us. Oregon Small Business for Responsible Leadership is with us. Now, having said that, Abraham Lincoln once asked, why should we have government? He answered his own question, the legitimate object of government is to do for a community of people whatever they need to have done, but cannot do at all or cannot do so well for themselves in their separate and individual capacities. And then he listed those things: common schools, caring for the helpless, young, and afflicted, the civil and criminal justice departments. Those are the same services these measures are designed to protect. Nothing newfangled, nothing fancy, just the same basic public services that we've relied on since Lincoln's day. 6 years ago, we played it Mr. McCormick's way. The legislature passed out an across-the-board temporary tax increase on all Oregonians with the nominal but not very real support of Mr. McCormick's clients. What happened? The measure was defeated, and schools across Oregon closed early. We kicked 50,000 people off the Oregon Health Plan, and we told thousands of seniors and people with disabilities that we no longer considered them disabled enough to receive care. This time, it's going to be different. This time, we're going to win. And we're going to have a heck of a victory party. And we'll have a lot of really wonderful people at that party. We'll have people from the League of Women Voters. We'll have people from ARP. We'll have people from PTA. We'll have people from Stand for Children. We'll have teachers and nurses and home health care workers and custodial workers and mental health workers, and will have their clients there too. The people at our victory party will be the people who have watched for the last 20 years as we've disinvested in vital public services. This time, we're going to celebrate that we were able to protect those services just by asking corporations and rich people to pay a little more. It is going to be a wonderful party, and I hope you'll all be there with us.
Mr. McCormick?
Thank you again for the chance to be here at the City Club Forum. It was 40 years ago this year that I became a member and got a chance to sit up on the stage as I listened to Russell Sadler, who was then a student member of the Oregon Board of Higher Education. So I appreciate what this forum does, and I'm disappointed that in this discussion about these measures, there wasn't an opportunity for a study group that could have looked carefully at these measures and reached its own recommendation for all of you in how to vote. It's a tough issue, and for Oregonians, I think they're looking to people who make and take the time to carefully consider these measures to determine how they should vote. Or editorial writers around the state have been looking at this issue and have been reaching their own conclusions. Just in this past week, we've had editorials recommending a no vote on these measures in Bend, in the Portland Tribune this week, and also in the Oregonian. And with your indulgence, I just want to share some of the comments that came from the Oregonian editorial this week to remind you of what those folks who looked carefully at these issues said about them. Of all times, of all things, the Democrats in the Oregon Legislature chose now, in the throes of one of the worst recessions in history, to make business an enemy. They chose this moment to pit business against schools, the private sector against public unions, employers against the jobless. The two referrals on the January 26th special election ballot, Measure 66 and 67, insist that Oregonians pick a side to accept one lousy, harmful choice or the other. No, we won't do it. You shouldn't either. It didn't have to come to this. The Democrats who control the legislature could have approved a modest and mostly temporary package of business tax increases with the full support of the Oregon Business Association and others, which represents many of the state's largest and most public-minded companies. Instead, Democrats bent on the demands of the most liberal members of their House caucus and bent to the demands of the most liberal members of their House caucus and approved an unwise and ill-timed package of corporate and personal tax increases that has infuriated virtually every business group and commercial sector in the state. The Democrats hold a supermajority of the seats in the legislature. They could have sent a proposal to reform the tax kicker and allow the state to build a strong and durable rainy day fund, to avert future revenue crises and address the most glaring problems of Oregon's system of public finance, its volatility. Instead, the Democrats buried kicker reform and chose to fill a hole in the budget by tacking more onto Oregon's already high personal income taxes, exacerbating the top-heavy volatility of the state's tax system. They said this was the wrong time, these are the wrong taxes, and recommended that voters vote no on Measures 66 and 67.
Thank you.
I want to thank our Truth Squad members, Brianne Arnold, Jeannie Crouch, and Ted Kay. Thank you also to our timekeepers, Tony Accarino and Elaine McCall, and a special thank you to our moderator, Sharon Van Sickle-Robbins, and of course, our greatest appreciation to our debaters, Pat McCormick and Steve Novick. Tune in next week for a look at Oregon's economy with economists Tom Patalski and Timothy Doy. We're adjourned.